Well, hello, my name is Irving Finkel, and I'm a curator in the British Museum. And from that standpoint, to my own standpoint, I'm going to join my dear colleague Sarah to talk about collecting and collections, which of course is a major preoccupation for museums and also for many people in this country.
And I'm Sarah Burles, and for many years I worked with collections, not so much with collectors, in museums and galleries, but actually on a rather different side to Irving, because I was on what's now known as the learning team and trying to make collections accessible and interesting to all sorts of different audiences.
That's a very commendable ambition. So look, to kick off, I have an idea that the human species, Homo sapiens, etc., divides into two camps. One camp is people who collect things and think collecting is fascinating and defend it fiercely and can't believe people don't do the same thing themselves. And the other half can't see any point in it. It's tedious and dull and also a waste of time. So there are two camps more or less in opposition. And under that big framework, of course, you have huge, big institutions which collect marvellous things from many centuries of time, treasures and precious things for the world to see, all the way down to schoolboys who collect stamps and marbles and all those other things, with all the intervening stages there of time and interest. So the whole picture, to me, is a very fascinating thing.
What do you think about the idea of a collecting gene that's been talked about, isn't it? That certain people have this sort of genetic thing.
That's an interesting
I'm not
question.
Sure it's,
Well, I could be a laboratory test case, if you like, because I was born into a family, like most people, with a mother and father. My mother and father thought collecting things was completely unintelligible. They had a kind of rule that you get things that you need. And that's that. So I used to buy books about Assyriology, which was my subject, so that there was no room in the house for them in the end, and they thought it was just out of control and not sensible. And so they didn't understand it. I've been a collector from the minute I could walk and talk. I don't know why, but it's just defined my life to a marked extent in many different areas. And my brother and sisters didn't collect anything. None of my 5 children collects anything. So if it is a gene, it's one of those genes that surfaces rather infrequently.
But there are many different motivations, aren't there, why people collect things. I mean, in my experience, I'm Cambridge-based. I worked at the Fitzwilliam Museum for many years and had worked with that collection, which, of course, was started off by an Anglo-Irish aristocrat in 1816 on his death. But the other great collection, of course, we have in Cambridge, we have many great collections in Cambridge, but the other one that I know well is Kettle's Yard, and that is a very different sort of collection because it's a collection made by Jim Ede, who was born in 1895, had terrible First World War experience, makes friends with artists, and in a way his collecting, I always view it, there are many dimensions to it, but essentially it was through friendship with artists. So that was I think that's a slightly different sort of collecting, although actually his first sort of purchases do go back to his teens. So he certainly liked to have things, and it's a fascinating house because his collection includes natural objects together with 20th century works of art, together with objects that he's found along the way in junk shops or wherever. So I think there's lots of different types of collectors and collecting.
I think that's true.
I think it's rather diverse.
He's not unique in this respect because Hans Sloane, for example, whose collection was the thing that gave the kickstart to the British Museum, collected everything you could possibly collect: antiquities, manuscripts, animal parts, shells, archaeological things, anthropological things. Wherever he had agents looking, people brought things to him. He bought whatever he could, and he collected in a way that a doctor in a white coat would say this is a very serious and worrying case, but it wasn't anything of the kind because it was governed by an overriding principle of the intrinsic importance of making major collections of things in the world in order to preserve them, because there's always the stage where things which prevail are eroded by time and uninterest, but also as a foundation for cultural identity and for study. All those motives come into force when you have a Catholic widespread sort of collection, more or less of the way you're talking, on a larger or smaller scale. So that's certainly a legitimate thing, but it would be interesting to speak to the curator who started that, led it, what his idea behind it was, because it sounds to me as if it might have evolved out of what was normal collecting into something more full of outreach and working with creative persons, which is a rather different thing, isn't it?
Yes, and I think for Jim Ede that he started collecting because he became friends with artists. He was working at what's now the Tate in the 1920s. He believed in the power of art to bring balance and harmony, and that the things around you could give you some sort of comfort and I think balance, really. He talks a lot about balance and the way we look at collections. And one of the great things, of course, he does eventually is he comes back to Cambridge, he arranges his collection at Kettle's Yard, opens it to students especially, as he would say, in 1957, with that idea of discussing art and ideas with those who came to his open house. So a sort of house museum, as it were, although he always said it's not a museum because it's not a formal place. He wanted it to be governed by an informality. And all those ideas are completely fascinating and rather opposite, I think, to the culture of museums and galleries in which he grew up and actually worked in the. Well,
you could say the opposite, but you could say that one grew out of the other, because in the British Museum we have stuff from all over the world, and a lot of it's very beautiful, a lot of it's very mysterious, different colours, different sizes, all the things to attract the passing attention, and lots of people come to the museum to see things and to enjoy the experience, and they do enjoy the experience, and so in a way. The process of exhibition of any kind is a separate and distinct principle from collection, because you can't have any kind of exhibition without the stuff.
Yes.
So the different avenues in which collecting develops, the sort of branch things, sometimes they're quite sensible, sometimes they're very courageous, and sometimes they're inane. But the thing is, they're all predicated on the process of assembly, of witnesses, of stuff that lend themselves to telling stories and things like that. So I think that what's important is that sometimes in the world one has the impression that the word collector, the word collection, has a slight sort of, I don't know what about it, creates a whiff of disapproval. And it might be something to do with raincoats and nerds, because the general idea of collectors with a small c are those type of people who shuffle around with handbags and shopping bags, and they go to everywhere they can go to find whatever they're looking for, whatever it might be, like used batteries or something like that. And you have someone who's certifiably insane, has the biggest collection of used batteries in the world, but they put shelves in their room with all the big ones and the middle ones and all the way down there, and they think, gosh, at least I love the battery, I'm preserving it for the world, and one day I'll write a book and battery fans will come and see it. And anybody else who read a description of that, which is a perfectly practical and possible thing to happen, would think the guy was screwy. So this is one thing. And then the other disapproval comes when you have long-running collections, national collections, which have been put together in all sorts of ways, where the modern world would not allow such a collection to be formed because the political structure of the world and the geographical structure of the world and cultural identity and all these things which bear on collecting in the modern sense have evolved from an early stage where there was a disregard of things which nowadays might be regarded as very important. So I think there is a sort of unpleasant thing. So when I grew up, when I was a boy, all the boys in my class, all of them, collected something, all of them. And everybody collected stamps, coins, cards, and tea cards, and I don't know, all that kind of stuff. And most of the girls also did. So it was a kind of normal thing at that stage, say 13 to 15, 16, to make this thing. So this, what I regard as a perfectly natural thing, which I lament the passing of, has been perverted in the modern world in the following way, because nowadays there are equivalent cards, for example, to the cigarette cards and tea cards. They used to be years and years ago, with pictures of Japanese monsters or footballers on, if there's any difference between them, I'm not sure. And you have to get the whole set of 75. And when they are produced, they are sold in newsagents, so you can buy them. And secondly, some of them are marked rarities on the outer wrapping, as if that's a rational thing. Whereas, of course, in the real tradition of collecting, the rarity is something which is defined by the reality of nature and statistics and number and history. You can't say this one is a rarity and print 5,000 of them like all the others. So the idea of collecting, which I think is sort of simple, is you get interested in something and you want to accumulate examples, and you know some things you'll never get and you have to adjust and you try and pay for them and you can't pay. All those sorts of things are part of what I regard as a healthy form of collecting.
So there's a slightly unhealthy form of sort of hoarding, perhaps, and collecting in a slightly obsessive way, which we've sort of mentioned already. But I do also think about some of the great collectors who have given us, as we both know, in our museum world,
this is true,
so much. For example, Lord Fitzwilliam, who leaves his collection to Cambridge and to the university, and then actually the Fitzwilliam, where I've spent many years, has often been described as a collection of collections. And we've got all sorts of fascinating collectors who were involved in those. And one of my personal favourites is a man called Dr. Glacier, who was a maths don at Trinity College, Cambridge, and was a great collector of ceramics and particularly English pottery, when other people weren't interested in that at all. So actually we have him to thank for this extraordinary, enormous collection of pottery and ceramics at the Fitzwilliam.
Yeah.
But also, rather interestingly, he also collected samplers and Valentine cards. And I don't know why that sort of endears him to me, but I think these stories, and he was certainly, possibly we might classify him as marginally obsessive. He went round to maths conferences, and every time he went
I think
somewhere
anybody who goes to maths conferences is bound to be borderline of that kind. I think there's no question about it. Yes. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, yes. We in the BM, of course, we are indebted to all these collectors. Without them, the collection wouldn't exist. Mm-hmm. They've always supplemented and added things, and for a kind of common goal, which I have to say, although I worked there and been brought up by it and brainwashed and everything and eat in the canteen, I still believe in. I still think that major collections which try to bring under a roof materials for long-term study, preservation for, as it were, unborn children, is a legitimate thing in a world where many things are discarded and wrecked and not valued in the least, or they are valued in the commercial world beyond any kind of reality in terms of what they are really worth. So that also corrupts everything. So when you have a place like a museum or an art gallery with some kind of purse and some kind of acquisitive policy, or obsessively aggressive acquisitive policy, which is my own idea, then in the end the results are beneficial for a wider scale of people than the original lunatics.
Well, I suppose it depends what you do with your collections, doesn't it? Whether you give it away, as you at the end of your life or during your lifetime, make it accessible to general public, open it up. So there's all sorts of examples, aren't there, of different collectors all around the world and in different parts of in our museums. I mean, we all have so much to thank particular collectors for. But in a way, it's that collections are always going to be specific to a particular person and a particular interest. And I think the challenge now for collections, possibly, and certainly I would still call it my museum at the Fitzwilliam, is trying to fill in gaps within some of their collections. So, for example, buying more work by women artists, by buying work by artists from different backgrounds and different parts of the globe, which is, to me, incredibly important. That we've inherited collections, but we also need to think about our collecting. And I suppose that's the challenge for museums, isn't it? I mean, I worked in a local museum where we had all sorts of many different sort of local collections, from sort of sculptures made of bone by Napoleonic prisoner of war to sort of stuffed birds and that sort of collection. Now, how we use those collections was what I always was thinking about when I was working in those museums, how we make those relevant to people who are coming in today and what we're doing with them. But also, I suppose the challenge now is a lot of museums have run out of space and
money.
Yes,
and they sell their collections. And also, some people think that stuffed animals and birds are cruel.
Yes,
and
they are problematic
apologise
now.
to their children and all that kind of thing. So many of the principles which ran clear and free for a long period of time, where all the so-called professionals, museums and art galleries, and to some extent universities, took everything for granted about collecting. Nobody said that it had any pitfalls or disasters or there was anything wrong with it. And that is why there's been such a fantastic accumulation of stuff where in the modern world it's all different. So, for example, our own acquisitions in the museum are limited more or less to ephemera of all kinds and ethnographical material where things can be legitimately taken, but we don't, on the whole, buy things which are like what we used to unless they're well with provenance and they're jolly cheap or something like that. So we also try to fill gaps, but you can't. It's difficult. I mean, for example, there's nothing about the Beatles in the British Museum, as I once looked online. So you wouldn't know if you were a Martian interested in music and you went to the British Museum, well, it's bound to be in here because they know all about that stuff. There's nothing about the Beatles at all. And the Beatles are quite important in the world, let alone Britain. So you can never have completion.
Quick interval and we'll be right back. Did you know your favourite Artfully Said guests are closer than you think? With monthly talks by accredited lecturers across the UK and beyond, there's an art society near you. Join your local art society at theartsociety.org. Thank you to Boom Radio for sponsoring this episode of Artfully Said, brought to you by the Art Society.
Before the Beatles, my life was black and white, and after the Beatles, my life was colour.
Boom Radio, we're here because you were there.
Boom Radio plays 60s classics, 70s memories and hidden gems. Find it on your DAB+ radio across most of the UK or ask for it on your smart speaker. OK, let's get back to it.
You can't really
you can't have
that.
complete narratives, can we, within museums and within collections. Inevitably, they are going to be historic or specific in some way. And I think quite often if I'm taking people to museums and galleries, I give a bit of a history of the place because I think obviously that affects, if you're in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, it's a different story to the National Galleries in Scotland or the Fitzwilliam or, in different types of museum. I mean, you've worked in a national museum, you work in a national museum, I worked in a university museum, I worked in local museums, which is very different. So all those places are different. The way they get their collections, the collections they have are different. I mean, we had a collection of flat irons, Victorian flat irons in a museum that I worked in, which we used.
It sounds to me
often
prime significance. Really, I mean, I really think that deserves the greatest praise and attention. Somebody once, there was a guy, an Englishman, who was a doctor in tropical diseases somewhere, as they say in Africa. I don't remember where he was, but when he was there, he was responsible for the spread of disease or stopping it, and he got interested in mouse traps and rat traps because they were obviously one of the agents. So he started collecting mouse traps and rat traps, and he bought, I think, one of each kind available in the whole of Africa and carried on round the world. Japan, France, all had their own special kinds of rat traps with extra spring or extra this or special cheese place, I don't know what. And he then made replicas of things described in Greek and Roman manuscripts. So he had the definitive collection of mouse traps or traps of this kind. So from my point of view as a curator, this is gold dust because it means A, if you're ever going to be interested in it, you've got everything already, and B, one day there'll be a marvellous exhibition about mouse and rat traps and everybody will come and think how fantastic and how interesting, and all through history people have had to deal with rodents and all that. There's all sorts of stories and they're not all stupid. And what happened was that it wasn't accepted and the basic reason was that there wasn't a department of traps. So you see, they didn't know what to do with them. So the medieval ones would go in the medieval department, the models of Greek and Roman ones would go in the classical. So I thought that was daft. So my personal feeling about this, in order to arrest mushy thinking and prevent disaster, is that there ought to be a building like the Albert Hall, but 4 times bigger, divided up into triangles like cheeses in one of those cheese boxes. And this huge area will be made available to rescue unusual, idiosyncratic or important collections made by people, not by institutions, when they die. Because what normally happens is you have a nutcase who likes, for example, rat traps or anything of the kind. I know somebody who collected used stamp hinges, for example. The minute they die, the wife cannot wait to order a skip, and probably 3 skips to get rid of the stuff once and for all and never have to think about it. So there's always this terrible, terrible danger. And I think if we had a museum like that, then all sorts of very developed, lifelong collections of stuff that to some person or persons made sense is worth keeping as such, on the assumption that even if people today would regard it with scorn and derision, it will in the future acquire a totally different kind of status.
Yes, and we don't really know what the future holds, do we? I mean, we can't look ahead and think what will be valued in the future. In fact, last week I was lucky enough to be in Florence in Italy, and there's a lovely museum up at Fiesole, which was created by a man called Bandini, who was a late 18th century collector. And it's a lovely little museum that is his collection, and he was collecting early Italian paintings or bits of early Italian paintings when it was really rather out of fashion. The fashion was the 16th and 17th century paintings, but actually Bandini thought no, the 14th and 15th century paintings are actually absolutely marvellous, and there were little bits of altarpiece and bits of predella panels that he collected.
Yes.
And then set up his own museum. So I think probably the answer to your rat trap man maybe is that he should leave enough money to set up a trap museum, and then there would be a museum, wouldn't there? I mean, a bit like in Turin, you have a museum of the car, you have museums of planes, but we need, if you have there's a little museum in...
dead cert. See, what happens with the rat trap thing is, say you live in Guildford and you have a small house and you have all the rat traps all out, and you open the front door to people, cup of tea, come and see the collection. So what would happen is lots of people would lose a finger by saying, oh, I wonder how this one works, and then they'd be like that. So you'd have to have health insurance. You'd never be able to get the health insurance. You'd never be able to get anything like that.
Yes, but if you somehow leave
mucks it up.
Yes,
you know, there was a sorry to interrupt you. There was a young woman at the university who wrote a book about small private collections all over the British Isles.
Oh, how fascinating!
She went to them, drove there, knocked on the door, and there were people who collected everything you can imagine, and she interviewed them all, and she discovered an interesting principle about collecting, which is if you have one partner who's obsessive and the other hates it, you get the skip, it's all finished, and the kids never want it. But if you have a husband and wife team, they are lethal, because working together, they manage to accumulate a collection of international quality, not using any money or anything other than sheer determination. I admire this. These are the sorts of collections which we really ought to build this thing for. For example, yes. I'll tell you one thing about this, which I thought, we had a meeting once when her book was published, and everybody came, and 1 or 2 of the collectors, and there was a man and a wife, and they collected Bakelite, and they collected Bakelite like you can't imagine, as thoroughly as was possible. And when he arrived, I was very upset and disappointed that he wasn't wearing a Bakelite suit, because I would have thought that would have been absolutely the convincing point.
Yes. Oh, well, there are, yes. I mean, there are so many fascinating small collections out there. Do you think what we are left with collections is something to do with value, though? Because, I mean, my little jug collection has no value to anyone except for myself, because there's nothing terribly rare or special about it. But I wonder whether the things that end up in museums and galleries have to now have a certain commercial value, do you think? I mean, do you think value, I mean, how we value things is another big question, isn't it?
But I think this is there's always an example of the principle that things are worth more than the sum of the parts, because you might have a miscellaneous collection of things which individually are not valuable, but when they're put together by a collector, a sentient collector with a rational conception behind it, then the whole achieves a value from a scientific, scholarly or artistic point of view, but also slightly from a commercial point of view.
Yes.
Because it becomes something else more than just the odd row of things.
Yes, so that might be a sort of a bonus, I think, of collecting rather than a sort of
It
reason
might
for
be.
doing it. And I
But
think
the thing is, if you're a collector,
yes.
the thing is not to die.
Yes.
The whole idea of dying for a collector is anathema, because you think all those auction houses I'll never, things on eBay I miss and all that stuff. It's
Yes.
terrible.
And it's sort of always rather sad, isn't it, when you see a collection come up, in
Yes.
an auction house or something that is the collection. But I suppose unless it goes to a
it's
museum or
terrible.
gallery,
It never does.
it's inevitable.
And you know the worst thing is you get a catalogue and it says one, shall we say, one print of a barber shop and 39 others. All
Yes.
in one lot, and the guy must have spent all of his life trying to find different period engravings of people shaving and the equipment, and made a fantastic thing like that. And when he got to the auction, his one's picked, and all the rest come with it.
Yes.
That is the worst smack in the face.
But I suppose the other thing about being a collector, I mean, you're a collector. I'm
I am.
possibly
I
a
admit.
collector.
Yes.
But it gives you joy, doesn't it? So actually, perhaps we were getting, as museum people, perhaps we're a little bit too obsessed by what's going to happen. And we see historic collections that have come our way, yours at the British Museum and mine at the museums where I've worked. But actually, I wonder whether actually part of being a collector, and I think when I think about interviews with contemporary art collectors, for example, one of the motivational factors, not for them all, this is, broad brush, but is that joy of having things around them that they enjoy. And actually, I always think a work of art, in a way, is the sort of ultimate expression of that, because there's not really any use for a painting in many ways. It might fill a gap in a wall, possibly, but it doesn't really have a use apart from its absolutely glorious aesthetic value. It gives you joy. So you go and, if you've got I suppose my passion is paintings, really. But if I look at paintings I have at home, or certainly when I go to galleries, there's just a joy to look at those and look at that collection.
That is true, but the trouble is,
it's sort of a joy for the collector. Yeah,
is that as far as I can see, in the world of painting, the commercial value is never far from people's minds, because paintings are bought and sold, and they go up and up and up. And they're commanded by a commercial principle in a way that most things that private individuals collect aren't, because they're not so popular. But you can hardly escape if someone shows you their things in their sitting room in the walls. You're bracing yourself for the moment and saying, I got it for only $150,000 kind of thing. And nobody's wife throws away their paintings, or husband throws away their paintings, because they're straight down the auction house, because they know that it's a very steady thing. It's a kind of investment matter, and there are big institutions that invest in painting just for commercial reasons. So it's a special case, because I don't think it's possible to be a naive, pure and unadulterated collector of paintings where you don't give a fig for its value, especially as you can't get it if you don't pay the value.
Well, yes, but it depends, doesn't it? I mean, I think I went to see some collectors recently in Cambridge who collect 20th century Scottish art. They were very kind. They were private collection. I was doing a talk, and they came up to me after and said, "Would you like to come and see our collection?" I said that would be absolutely marvellous. And when I was walking around, yes, the works that they've bought over the years have gone up in value, but I didn't feel that was, and that was obviously a bonus, I think, but actually I felt that they bought it because they loved things, and then they were interested because they would buy one thing by an artist, and then another artist is at the same time, the similar period, and then they are putting gradually the collection grows over the years because they get interested, and as you say, scholarship comes in.
That is
and to
good,
me, those are the
stuff.
sort of good,
yes.
normal collectors, and we've gone down the sort of obsessive collectors and the slightly hoarding type route. But actually, I think there's something rather wonderful about having things around you that you really love and are interested in, and I don't think you have to always make it sort of a monetary thing. I mean, perhaps some things that you want to buy you can't because you haven't got the means, but I mean, so again, going back to Jim Ede and Kettle's Yard, he would be given a painting or for the price of the frame by his friend Ben Nicholson in the 20s, and Ben would just say, well, you can have it for the price of the frame, Jim, because I haven't sold it this year. So there was a sort of collecting through friendship. And actually he was a collector who really, didn't, he didn't have lots of money. He was quite a wheeler dealer as well, but he was able to put together an extraordinary collection through different means, really, and also just buying things that probably, some plates with chips that we wouldn't think would have much value, and they probably don't have much value, but they are of value in terms of what he then did with them and how he curates his home, and then actually the extraordinary thing of giving it away. So I think that thing of giving away a collection in some way is also, to me, very appealing, but also haven't we all benefited from those who came before us, who had extraordinary collections and then gave them
but there is a difference between collecting things that adorn your house and give you pleasure and give pleasure to people who come and so forth, and possibly end up in galleries. But this is a special avenue for a certain limited amount of material, because many things which people collect, they don't exhibit. You can't exhibit them. They keep them in drawers and boxes and things like that, and they don't show them off because many people wouldn't find them interesting. And so that's not the whole story, is it?
No.
But I still maintain that all the publicity which is given at auctions, paintings are almost always sold for a record figure for this artist, or very close, and nothing shrinks in value, and you don't have collectors all around England saying, "Oh God, and my Canaletto is valueless." It doesn't work that way. It's part of the heartbeat of art, and it affects artists, and it affects what they do, and it affects collectors and museums. It's indivisible, in my opinion, from commercial, harsh reality, even if an individual person doesn't operate in that scale. But that's neither here nor there. Also, there's something rather good about working for a museum collection, which is in the collection, is that it won't be sold, it won't be given away, it won't be parted with, it becomes part of a much bigger whole. And this is a very wholesome atmosphere in which collections can exist.
Yes, and also we can see them in different places because museum collections will lend to each other, galleries will lend to each other, so we can get these wonderful exhibitions where we get loans of particular collections coming being travelling or whatever, and that's a great joy, isn't it, when we see that and different parts
if they come back in one piece.
Yes. I don't think I totally agree. People say to me, what should you, if you want to buy a painting, should you buy something that's well known? But I think you just have to buy what you love and what speaks to you. Obviously, there are some art collectors who buy because they want to buy and create a market to some extent. So the whole art market thing is a very different point, which I've never worked in. But I think, obviously, they're dealing with collectors. But I think that thing of sort of adding to what you've got already is very interesting, isn't it? And perhaps all the collectors were thinking about, you get one thing and then you want to try and somehow, add a bit more to that collection, whether it's another painting or another print or another Roman pot or another book or whatever it is to finish your edition, as it were. So I suppose the other challenge always, and what I've spent my life in museums doing, was how we open up our collections and how we think about our collections once they're in the museum to audiences and different audiences, and make those things that we're interested in relevant to other people. So obviously that changes over. Well, certainly changes over our lifetime, how that's been seen, and I don't know what we think about collections now and how much should be on display. And obviously, some museums are opening up their depots now and their reserve collections more. The V&A are doing that. I've seen it done in Europe as well and in America. So that's an interesting thing, isn't it? How much we, as museum people, or in my case as an ex-museum person, how we show our collections and how we open them up to people.
Yes. Well, lots of people say that a disadvantage of a large museum is that people only see a fraction of the collections. But the reality of it, in our case, and I'm sure in many other large museums, is that everything which is really important and really interesting and really unlike everything else and typologically important is on exhibition. And we have study collections which are unimaginably huge, but for the normal person, they are just more of the same. And if we try to put, I'd like to do this, put all the cuneiform tablets which we have in my department out on exhibition. There's 130,000 of them, and it would be a very spectacular thing. And I would hope that all the public would be delirious with glee, but actually they probably step back through the door, and resolve never to go in the building again. So you have to have a balance. I think collecting and exhibiting collecting is a whole complex matter, because some people think objects speak for themselves and they need a minimal amount of explanation. Some people write lots and lots and lots about something which nobody ever reads. And it's a very difficult compromise to stop things being inert and to have a message, and the message which is in fact what it really did stand for in the first place. But I personally think that the way objects are exhibited in museums at the moment is rather in its infancy, because there's not a lot of progress made, there's not a lot of consideration, and the simplest way to get understanding of how it works is to look at what happens to people in the galleries, how they behave. But anyway, I think we should resolutely can agree between us that collecting is a healthy thing.
Yes.
That whatever you do, if you're big and avaricious and have all the banks of Switzerland under your belt, or if you're a humble curator who can only afford things now and again, you're not a nerd or some obsessive, but what you do bears fruit. Not only for the point of view of the collector or the institution, but also will bear fruit on a broader level, in my opinion, in times to come, provided that museums survive and the world in which they sit is left to survive as well.
Yes, and I think we can both agree that, collections are, we've said worked with collections for all our careers, or most of mine, and actually they are incredibly important because they connect us with the past. A museum I worked in many years ago, we had some Roman pottery, and on one of the pots that we were actually able to handle with and pass around to groups that came in, there was the handprint of the potter who made the pot, as he put it, possibly a she, put it into the slip. And I think that connectivity with that connection with the past, when people would put their hand on the hand of the Roman potter, that is something that is so important that museums can offer, and to connect us with our histories, to connect us with artists, with makers, with the material culture that of different civilizations and different parts of the world, and ultimately that sort of human connection. I suppose quite often the things that I've found in the past taking different audiences to museums, the things that connect to us almost most are the things, the toy, the child's toy from 4,000 years ago, whatever it may be, that's somehow just so human, that we are all human beings and we somehow make things, and those things have value to us, and that's essentially what we then end up with in our collections. And of course we have only the things that survive, so there's lots that doesn't survive, isn't there? But actually how important that is, and how yes, just that sort of cycle of history and the past, but also the present and the future, as we look at our collections. Lots to think about endlessly, and narratives, and how we're presenting things.
Yes, well, I agree with you, and I think that all museums should have over the doorway a flag embroidered with the message that everybody's work in this museum was made by a human being like you, because this doesn't come out from collections and exhibitions. It has to be teased out and it has to be pointed out. But that is a very important matter, and it'll be increasingly important in the future when people have two heads and they're all made of metal, to discover what things were like in the past when we had bipedal humans and all the things they made. Well, I think that about the whole business of collection. I think it's meritorious and beneficial to mankind, and I think that one of the things that I always try and do is to make children look at things, because adults, when they reach a certain stage, don't look at anything at all. They're always thinking about something else. But when you get children, their minds are full of energy and the most extraordinary imagination, and they are the people to pitch at. And in all the collections of the museum and in all the staff of the museum, there's nobody who's in charge of children. And I think we should have a children's curator who would make sure that all the things at eye level, in all the cases, had things like pull-along toys and dolls and all the other things like that from all around the world. Because otherwise, if you're a child being dragged around the collection, all you see is trouser legs if you're or jeans.
Well, it depends. We've done exhibitions for children in the past.
We don't. So I want to do them. I think they're important.
Which would be
it's
wonderful.
Good. Yeah,
yes.
It's a very good thing.
Yes.
And then you get, of course, the situation that children become collectors themselves, thinking museums are very good things. So it's a self-perpetuating benefit.
Yes, definitely. Yes. And collections are definitely a good thing. Collectors are endlessly fascinating and endlessly varied, I think, the motivations and what they collect and how they collect, and but it's all a very fascinating subject, and it's been interesting to explore it together
from
our different viewpoints.
Subscribe for more episodes of Artfully Said, brought to you by the Arts Society.